Hello everybody, I am Evelil and I will tell you one story of a good viewing. For 100 years, the world has unknowingly been shaped by a force most would never believe existed. It began small, barely perceptible, like a shift in the air or the briefest flicker at the corner of your eye. And yet, despite its subtlety, the influence of the demon grew, inching ever closer, wrapping its tendrils into the very fabric of our lives. Its presence was not immediately terrifying, nor was it something we could touch or see directly. But it was always there, lurking just beyond comprehension, manipulating the darkest corners of our thoughts, dreams, and reality. The first signs were trivial, strange accidents, brief moments of inexplicable dread, whispers in the dead of night that no one could identify. The world, as it always does, brushed it off. People got on with their lives. We had become too distracted, too comfortable with our own technological advances to notice the creeping malevolence that was tightening its grip around the globe. That was until, one day, it could no longer be ignored. It began in a small town, one of those forgotten places that no longer appeared on most maps, nestled deep in a valley where the fog never seemed to lift. A place where the locals spoke in hushed tones and where the long-abandoned minds whispered of things that shouldn't be spoken aloud. The town of Fenlock was no stranger to strange happenings, but this was different. The first victim was Thomas, a quiet man who worked as a groundskeeper for the cemetery. The morning he disappeared, the entire town was blanketed by a dense fog, so thick that people couldn't see beyond the doorsteps of their own homes. But when Thomas's body was found in the cemetery, it was the state of his remains that would haunt those who looked upon him for the rest of their lives. His skin had been stripped away as if something had scraped it off with agonizing precision. His eyes were missing, leaving only hollow sockets. But it wasn't the grisly state of his corpse that was most disturbing, it was the symbols carved into his chest, symbols no one could understand, as if they had been marked by something otherworldly. When the town authorities investigated, they found that there was no sign of struggle. No trace of blood leading from the graveyard. It was as though Thomas had simply ceased to exist, his body placed there by some invisible hand. The local police couldn't find any logical explanation. They chalked it up to an animal attack, despite the utter lack of any animal tracks in the surrounding area. But those who had known Thomas weren't convinced. His wife, Emily, had seen something on the night he disappeared. A shadow moving unnaturally through the trees, taller than a man, blacker than the night itself. Emily's account was dismissed, her grief written off as delusion. Yet, even as the police left the cemetery and the fog cleared, something shifted in the atmosphere, a heavy, oppressive weight that clung to the town. Over the next few months, more bodies began to appear, each one more grotesque than the last. The townspeople couldn't explain what was happening. Some whispered about the mines, others about the ancient folklore of the valley. It wasn't until Father Robert, the local priest, stumbled upon a set of old tomes in the dusty back corners of the church's library that they began to understand, though they wished they hadn't. Father Robert had always been a man of faith, a man who found comfort in prayer and ritual, who could always explain the mysteries of life with a biblical interpretation. But the tomes he uncovered told a different story, one of ancient beings who existed long before humanity had ever learned to speak. The demon of the valley, as it was known, was not a creature of flesh and bone but an entity made of darkness, a being that fed on fear and manipulated time itself. The energy it exuded had started to grow in recent decades, spreading across the earth, preparing for something worse. By the time Father Robert pieced the story together, he realized that the entity's reach was no longer confined to Fenlock. The ripples of its influence had begun to spread like wildfire, affecting people across the globe. There was no logical explanation for the increasing number of strange occurrences, a sudden surge in natural disasters, inexplicable disease outbreaks, and a rising tide of violence. The horrors were far too coordinated to be merely coincidence. The demon had awakened and it was stirring. On the night Father Robert made his final discovery, he attempted to burn the books to rid himself of the knowledge that now consumed him. But as the flames licked the edges of the pages, a whisper, low and sibilant, brushed against his ear. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Father Robert dropped the books into the fire and fled into the night. He never returned to the church. The first sign of the entity's true power came on a quiet evening in London. At first, it was just a strange buzzing noise in the streets, a low hum that grew louder with each passing second. People stopped in their tracks, clutching their ears as the noise grew to an unbearable pitch. Then the ground trembled. Buildings cracked. The sky darkened unnaturally, the sun obscured by a rolling cloud that seemed to move with purpose. The energy in the air felt wrong, like something had shifted in the very core of reality itself. By the time the chaos had subsided, hundreds had died. And no one could explain why. Across the globe, similar events were taking place. In Tokyo, entire blocks vanished without a trace, as though swallowed whole by the earth. In New York, people began to see figures, tall, gaunt shadows that stretched and contorted in unnatural shapes, moving through the alleyways. The strange occurrences grew in number and severity, and the whispers of a demonic force grew louder. But the most terrifying part was that it seemed no one could remember when the world had been normal. It was as if reality itself had been subtly rewritten, one terrifying event at a time. It was during this time that a man named Samuel Brooks, an eccentric historian, became obsessed with the patterns. He had always been intrigued by the supernatural, but it wasn't until the incidents in London and New York that he realized what was happening. It wasn't random chaos. The demon, or whatever it was preparing the world for something. The attacks, the disturbances, they weren't simply meant to cause fear. They were part of a much larger plan. Samuel scoured ancient texts, government files, and reports from around the world, piecing together an unsettling picture. There was a reason why the demonic energy had begun to spread so strongly in the last century. The demon had been waiting for the right moment, and the time was now. The ritual to fully unleash its power was close, and it needed one final sacrifice. But the world was not prepared. Samuel's research led him to an abandoned monastery in the hills of Scotland where he hoped to find answers. But when he arrived, there were only remnants of what had once been a place of learning, a place long forgotten by time. The monastery, now dilapidated and overrun by creeping ivy, seemed empty at first, but the moment he stepped inside, the air changed. It grew cold. His breath came out in sharp puffs, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. In the heart of the monastery, hidden beneath the floorboards, Samuel found an old stone altar. The altar was covered in thick layers of dust, but as he wiped it away, the symbols carved into its surface became clear, symbols that matched those found on Thomas's body. Samuel was beginning to realize that the ritual had been set in motion long ago, and they had been slowly preparing the world for the demon's return. But the real horror wasn't in what had happened, but what was still to come. He wasn't alone. The silence in the monastery grew unbearable as Samuel's breath quickened. The cold that gripped him seemed to come from all sides, suffocating, pressing against his chest. He turned, eyes darting over the darkened corners of the room, but there was nothing, only the shadows, stretching farther than they should, deeper than they ought to go. And yet, he could feel it, something was watching him. He stepped back from the altar, his pulse hammering in his throat, his mind racing. The symbols, those same marks etched into the flesh of Thomas, were etched into the stone, ancient and cruel. The realization hit him with the force of a blow. The ritual wasn't complete. It needed one final offering. The altar, once a place of holy reverence, had been corrupted. It was here that the demon's resurrection would take place, if the final steps of the ritual were completed. Samuel's eyes flitted nervously to the walls, searching for any signs of movement. The shadows in the corners of the room felt alive, twitching, breathing. Suddenly, the air around him grew thicker, charged with an electric hum, and for the first time, Samuel could hear it, whispers. Low and indecipherable, they curled around his mind like tendrils of smoke, slithering into his thoughts. They were almost familiar, the words echoing in the back of his skull. It is time. The air grew darker, more oppressive, as though the very light itself was being consumed by something hungry, something ancient. The shadows began to move, and not as static shapes, but as living things, twisting and crawling along the floor, walls, and ceiling. Samuel stumbled backward, heart racing, only to feel the cold air wrap around his limbs like chains, pulling him towards the altar. Then, in the farthest corner of the room, a form began to emerge. At first, it was vague, a distortion in the light, a movement too fluid to be natural. But as it solidified, Samuel saw it, a tall figure, its body cloaked in darkness, features sharp and indistinct, like a silhouette of a nightmare. It had no face, only a void where one should have been, its body formless but impossibly tall, looming over Samuel, casting a shadow that consumed the entire room. You should not have come, the voice reverberated through the air, not spoken but felt deep inside Samuel's chest, like a drumbeat in his very bones. He stumbled backward, breath caught in his throat. The demon stood before him, its presence suffocating, its form shifting in the shadows. It was both monstrous and ancient, a creature that seemed to bend and twist the laws of reality to its will. I have waited for this moment, it hissed, the sound like the scraping of metal on stone. 100 years. You are nothing but a pawn in my game. Samuel could barely speak. His voice was caught in his throat, the words of warning dying on his lips. He wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare, but the shadows had already closed in on him, holding him in place. The demon raised its hand and the temperature in the room plummeted even further. You have seen the signs, Samuel Brooks. You have felt it in the air, the growing tension, the inexplicable fear that tightens its grip on humanity. The world is ripe, waiting for my return. And now it is too late to stop me. The demon's form flickered like a flame in the wind, and for a moment Samuel thought he saw something beyond the darkness. A pair of eyes. But they were not eyes. They were portals to something far older, deeper, and incomprehensible, like two black holes staring into his soul, pulling him toward the void. This is only the beginning, it whispered. The world will burn. The final sacrifice is upon us. The veil between worlds is thin, and I will tear it wide open. As the demon spoke, the monastery seemed to respond. The walls groaned as if alive, shifting and twisting as though they were being pulled apart by an invisible force. The floor beneath Samuel's feet trembled, and the altar began to glow, faint symbols flickering in the dim light. The demon's power was growing stronger by the second. The ritual must be completed. And you, Samuel, are the final piece. The demon raised its arms, and the shadows around Samuel surged forward like a tidal wave. In that moment, Samuel understood. He wasn't just a witness, he was the offering. The demon needed him to complete the ritual. The very air around him pulsed with dark energy as the shadows coiled tighter around his limbs, digging into his flesh like sharp claws. Samuel struggled, trying to break free, but it was hopeless. He could feel the weight of the demon's presence crushing him, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. The whispers grew louder, clearer, maddening. The walls were closing in, the altar glowing brighter and brighter, and the shadows had wrapped themselves around him like ropes, binding him to the very ground. No! Samuel gasped, his voice barely escaping his lips. But the demon only laughed, a sound that reverberated in his mind, twisting everything he knew into something grotesque. You cannot stop what has already begun, Samuel. You are already lost. In an instant, the shadows surged forward, pulling Samuel to the altar, his body unwillingly stretched across its surface. The dark energy surrounded him, filling his lungs, his veins. The room seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the demon, each beat a reminder of how far gone they all were. Then the final act began. The shadows formed around Samuel's body, moving in fluid, unnatural motions, sinking into his skin, merging with his very essence. The altar pulsed in rhythm with his heart, and Samuel could feel the cold touch of the demon's power consuming him. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the dark abyss that had opened beneath him. In that moment, everything faded, the room, the monastery, the very world around him. He was no longer human. He was part of the darkness now, bound to it. His mind shattered, and with that final snap, his consciousness merged with the void. The demon's laughter echoed, hollow and triumphant. Meanwhile, back in Fenlock, strange things were happening. As Samuel's ritual reached its peak, the ripples of the demon's awakening began to spread. People across the world felt a sense of unease, as if something was terribly wrong, but no one could explain why. The skies darkened, a strange heaviness settled over the cities, and whispers of dread floated in the corners of every street. The demon was no longer a mere specter lurking in the shadows. It had begun to manifest, and soon it would claim the world as its own. The lines between the known world and the unknown were blurring. The shadows had begun to move. The end was near. Thank you very much, and see you all in the next video. Love you guys.